So the way that these events work are that we'll have the two presentations first, and I'd ask you if you could please keep your questions till the end, unless you have a question for clarification. So we'll have 2.5-hour presentations, and then we have up to 40 minutes for Q&A and discussion afterwards. The talks are being filmed, just so you know. The Q&A won't be filmed. So I think we're ready to go.
So thank you very much to Aizcorbe for inviting me here for the week to visit and for the opportunity to speak today about this issue about the measurement of inflation and potential biases in the indexes. Just to provide some context, there's been, as you know, a lot of interest lately on these measurement issues. There's productivity trends that are hard to explain and to sync up with anecdotal evidence in our own experience that there's a lot of innovation going on. Consumer welfare is likely rising rapidly, and then the question is, why don't we see it in the numbers? And so there's a huge number of issues that have come up. Some that are old issues that we've dealt with before, but have been exacerbated by the arrival of the digital economy. And then there are some new issues altogether that we just haven't dealt with before. So I work in a statistical agency that generates the GDP numbers. So when I say we, I'm talking about BEA, not economists or, But anyway, so of all of these issues, the one that I'm going to focus on in the talk has to do with measuring inflation or changes in prices versus improvements in quality associated with product innovation and new goods. So before I dive into that, I would be remiss if I didn't tell you all the work that my agency is doing to further this agenda. There's one of the things that we've started to do is to acknowledge that some of these issues are a little beyond our reach, in the sense that it requires sort of bigger think than perhaps the capacity that we have in-house. And so we've been doing a lot of partnering with academics, including Leonard, who's done a lot of work with my colleagues Rachel Soloveichik and John Samuels on the free goods issue. And Dan Sickle, who we found a data source to do cloud price indexes, but of course you have to sniff out the data source, and Dan Sickle had already spent 1.5 years learning about that sector and how it works, and so he helped us construct some price indexes there. So in addition to building links with outside academics and trying to make progress on some of the harder issues, we're also, measurement's gotten much harder, but the potential data sources to fix the measurement have gotten much better, arguably. And so at the same time that we're working on the conceptual issues, we're also very interested in learning about all these alternative data sources that could be used to follow things in real time. And that some data that could potentially be balanced or merged with traditional surveys of the kind that we typically use to improve the ways that we measure things. And then lurking behind all of this is the issue that that people have become very interested in measuring welfare, and they look to our measures of GDP to do so. I think everybody agrees that having measures, a way to measure consumer welfare, consumer well-being in the economy would be a very good thing. And I think everybody also agrees that the GDP that we calculate is not the best indicator for this. Okay, I think we all agree on that. The thing we don't agree with is who should fix it. Like should we do something about BEA? Should BEA do something to expand the scope of our measures to allow for some of this measurement? Should we change the price indexes so that they're more aligned with constant welfare indexes as opposed to constant quality indexes, which is the way that we typically look at things? And at the moment, I think as Rebecca alluded, that issue is going to take a while to sort out. You know, there is no consensus on a one way to fix it. There are probably 3, 4, 5 different ways that one could attack it. For accountants, and it's not really a GDP thing, it's more an accounting thing. You know, if you work in the private sector and you do financial statements for corporations, there are rules you have to follow, the Financial Accounting Service Board, FASB, and so on. And we, in the national accounts arena, have rules that we have to follow too. And it's very hard to break the rules without some sort of solid academic consensus that this definitely has to be changed. You know, we're missing a lot of important policy issues because the measures are showing one thing and we know other things are happening in the economy. But anyway, so what we've been doing in that area is just trying to convene experts, people like Angus Deaton, I think, are going to be part of a panel at the next American Economic Association meetings to try to help us get some sense for how close we might be to some sort of consensus. And in terms of setting priorities, there's going to be a long list of things to do. You know, when you start thinking about measuring welfare instead of GDP as we measure it. So these are the kinds of things that we've been working on. But as I said, I don't have much else to say about these other issues and want to focus the rest of the talk on the price index issue. Now, so this is not going to be one of those talks where we spend a lot of time talking about how BLS, our sister agency that does these numbers, how they do it. I mean, those discussions are very important for macroeconomists because they're looking at some CPI trends and they want to know to what extent those are the real numbers or what the potential biases are. And in order to do that, you have to do a deep dive into the methods that the BLS uses. What I would like to do today is, it would be nice if when you left today, you had a very clear picture of the ideas behind this concept of constant quality price indexes. What would that look like if you had the perfect data? And why is it that you can't really use that to tell you anything about welfare and so on? So I'm going to be very concrete about this stuff with specific examples and hopefully convey some of that information to you. And there's this smartphone price index that I calculated with my colleagues, Byrne and Sickle, and I'll use that to illustrate some of the points. Okay, so so there's this identity out there. If you look at the first line of the identity, you've got changes of spending. It's like the P's times the Q's all summed together across all sectors. You can think of conceptually anyway as being made up of two pieces, one that has to do with average prices and one that has to do with change in average prices and changes in quantities. So I'll just say right away that the free goods problem is really a problem here because we don't even get to spending. Okay, so the free stuff that Leonard's going to talk about. But for now, let's focus on what we can measure. Market transactions that involve positive prices that we actually pick up in our measures. Now, when prices can go up because for one of two reasons: either the prices of identical things went up, or these things are becoming better goods. When prices go up because things are becoming better goods, we don't want to count that as inflation. We want to count that as what we call real output, or similar to an increase in quantities. And so the second line there is sort of heuristically, you want to take the changes in the average prices and you want to split it into one thing that we call constant quality prices, and I'm going to explain what that is in a minute, and the rest, which is the piece of the variation in prices that's associated with goods getting better or goods getting worse. And if you substitute that into that first simple equation, you end up with the change in spending made up of two pieces. One that's just what we think of as change in constant quality prices, which is what we think of as inflation. It tells you something about what's happening to your purchasing power over time and such. And then the other piece, which is the change in the quantities as well as any changes in the quality of the goods. And so the mystery then is, well, how do you do that split between the change in, how do you split changes in the average price into these two components? There are basically two methods that I'm going to briefly show you. Match model method is goes after the change in the constant quality prices directly, and then delegates whatever's left to changes in quality, whereas hedonic techniques do the opposite. They try to measure the changes in quality directly using hedonic regressions, and then whatever's left they consider to be a change in constant quality prices. So let me give you a really quick example that, I'm not allowed to show you the data from the cell phones, especially if you're going to post these things online. So I've got an old data set for memory chips that shows the kinds of price contours that are typical for consumer durable and electronics equipment, IT equipment that's purchased by firms, and so on. And so, so if you had scanner data, the data would look something like this. Each good has a SKU or an identifier. The attributes of the good do not change over time. And in data like these, you see the good appear the moment it's purchased by someone, and you see it in the data until it finally expires. Unlike the methods of the BLS that sort of have a lot of, the data are spotty and not always there. And so then the question is, how can you, if you have this kind of data, how could you split out the quality versus quantity? And I just want to say right away, there's some markets where you can't use this at all. Okay, so housing, all the houses are different. You can't even draw these plots because what's sold today is different than what's sold tomorrow. Custom software is an area where we would really have liked to have constant quality price measures, but every software project is different than the other. Those areas are probably more best handled using hedonic techniques that we'll talk about in a minute. But while we're at it, to the extent that this digital revolution has allowed for the personalization of goods and services, this method is going to become less and less useful because you're not going to be able to draw lines for identical things over time like this. Anyhow, the way the split is done, and this is, suppose a chip comes in time period 0 and lives for one period, prices go down, and then when it expires at time t, it's immediately replaced by another chip that comes out at the same high price, and then the price falls over the life of the chip. And let's say this is all that's going on, no other goods or anything. Then the average price piece is the ratio of the last price, the second chip in the second period, divided by the first chip in the time period 0. So that thing to the left of the equal sign is a change in the average price in this simple example. And getting from one price to another involves 3 segments. One is the constant quality price change over the life of the first chip, and there's this jump in price. And then there's this constant quality price change over the life of the second chip. And what this method does is it says the difference in the price of the new chip and the old chip at time 1 is going to be interpreted as the market's valuation of the quality improvements in the new chip. Okay, so we view that as the valuation of the quality differences, and once you strip those out, you get a price index that declines really rapidly. So this is the way we think about it. But suppose you wanted to look at this and say, oh, that's really related to welfare anyway. I think there's an argument to be made there in the sense that, like, a really simple example would be to say, suppose there's a representative consumer that buys all the chips. If that consumer was willing to pay P21 for the new good and only willing to pay P11 for the other good, then the gap in those two prices tells you something about the willingness to pay of this representative consumer. I mean, there's models that you can write down that turn this into that give you a welfare interpretation of this, something more like a cost of living index. But that's not how we look at it. We look at this as just a way of controlling for quality change. And so, when there's lots of goods, you're picking time periods, you're calculating the price change for each of these identical goods, and then you're averaging them and coming up with a price index. And you're basically, all of those curves, you're shifting them down. And what you end up with when you get rid of the gaps between the new prices and the incumbent prices is a price index that falls really rapidly. And so this is the way, you know, the Byrne, Corrado, Sickle work on IT equipment and investment is all using data that look like these and methods like these. The data that we haven't looked at and don't know whether it looks this way or not is data for, you know, prices for services might not look like this at all, you know. And so it's not clear how applicable these methods would be in that case. So stopping here just to tell you a little bit about the smartphone data are sort of structured like scanner data. You've got revenues and number of phones reported at a very granular level, you know, like the iPhone 3GS, 12 gigabytes of storage, etc. And we have those data over, you know, a 7-year period. And the data also, you know, so we can use those data to do the match model indexes, but they also provide a huge list of attributes for each of the models that you can use to apply hedonics if you want to. So to show you what this thinking looked like for phones, there's this little problem that, I mean, some of it looks like the data that I showed you for memory chips in the sense that, you know, there are these step functions for some of these models. They're step functions, they're not smooth, but you know, prices start high and eventually go low. That seems to happen a lot. You know, the red line on the left, you know, the what is it, purple line on the right, the green. That seems reminiscent of what we saw a minute ago. The problem is, there's not only is there not much price change over the life of the phone, but new phones that are better phones come out at the same price as the old phone that's not as good. Okay, and so the whole strategy of using the gap in prices to tell you something about the market's valuation of the quality differences in the phones doesn't seem to be that applicable here in all cases. And we don't get a straight answer from, you know, the firms or, you know, industry experts at IDC that gave us the data. Why is it, you know, why would any company come out with a phone that's better and sell it at the same price, you know, if people are willing to pay more for it? But anyway, the data looks something like this. When you apply the matched model technique to this, the declines in the price index are not that fast. They're about 10% on average over the period, which is a lot less than what we see for other, you know, IT goods, consumer IT goods that display rapid rates of product innovation. And so, you know, we started thinking about the potential problems with the matched model method. And, you know, so 10% price declines, which, by the way, when we apply that, you know, that identity to back out what the implied quality change is, it's about 10% over the period, which we thought was low. And then when you come and look at the attributes of the phones, and there were lots of them, but these were the main ones, we thought, the average growth rate over this period for some of these attributes is really high, 33%, 29%. And so when you look at this, you have to ask yourself whether the matched model index that we just constructed adequately accounts for the fact that these phones in 2017 were much, much better than phones earlier in the period. And so there's this other technique that you're probably familiar with, hedonic regressions, which, you know, and I'm just gonna, we can talk about this a lot if you want to, but let's just sort of focus on the idea behind it. You've got prices that vary over time and across goods at a point in time. And this regression, that first box, is the X's are the, you know, the characteristics that I showed you here, things like processor speed, resolution, and RAM, which is the piece that we think of as quality. You know, the quality of the phone is a function of its characteristics, is the way that this model works. And so the regression, when you run a regression like that, and then the thing on the right is like a time dummy. the coefficient for the time dummy sops up whatever variation in the prices that can't be explained by the characteristics. Okay? And so like, as I said earlier, that, this goes after the quality piece directly, and then whatever's left that can't be explained by quality is relegated to constant quality price change through the time dummies. And so when we do this, we get much more rapid rates of price declines. And when you do the, crank things through the identity to see what the implied quality change is, it's about twice as fast as, a little less than twice as fast as what we got from the match model index. And so, we had lots of different types of regressions that we ran, to check the robustness of the price indexes, to different ways of doing it and so on. But I think in our preferred specification, really the indexes fall much faster when you explicitly account for the quality improvements in these phones. But then, there's this question lurking in the background. None of this has anything to do with welfare, in the sense that, the welfare that you get from using your phone doesn't just depend on how many gigahertz or, RAM or storage or whatever. It also depends on all sorts of things that are on your phone, the free stuff that Leonard's going to talk about. If you wanted to look at welfare, one of the things you'd have to look at is all the things that you don't have to buy because you now have a cell phone. And so this is an ad from, I don't know if you even know what Radio Shack is. It's like an electronics store where you buy electronic stuff. And this is and I actually stole this from Shane Greenstein. But it's an ad from 1991 where there's prices for all of these things that we now have accessible on our phone. I mean, I can't remember the last time I bought a map, or all of these things. And so ideally, when the first phone comes out, you have to somehow account for the fact that, the price of that functionality has now really gone down because you get it all from your phone. And I don't know that anybody has done that, but then in addition to that, this doesn't even get at the idea that in addition to all these things that you don't have to buy, you've got capabilities on your phone that you never had before, GPS and such. And so, and I think that all these questions about welfare and what's, how the digital economy has allowed consumers to, this is Leonard's point, maximize welfare easier, lower search costs and all of that. I think those questions are really interesting and important. But I just wanted you to understand that the way that GDP is currently measured, we don't address those questions in the account. And it would be really nice to have some sort of roadmap for how to either change that or add a supplemental set of accounts to answer these kinds of important questions as well. So that's it. Thank you very much.
So I'm Leonard Nakamura. I'm emeritus economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, and I have to say these are my opinions and definitely not those of the Federal Reserve System, as you'll see when I get into this talk. So what we're talking about are some of the most important things that economists care about, right? So we're going to talk about productivity and inflation, right? What is productivity growth? Well, at base, economists like productivity growth or love productivity growth because it's permanent, right? The Solow growth model is all about permanent growth. And it's about permanent increases in human capability, right? What we can do with an hour of our time. And because we think that way, we think, well, productivity growth is always good, even if it involves temporary dislocations, right? So, more efficiency through trade or more efficiency through technological progress all involves temporary dislocations. But that's minor because it's short run and productivity is permanent. Right? So I want you to be thinking about what is permanent growth. Inflation is central to economics because it's all about how much a dollar will be worth to you in the future compared to how much it's worth today. The real rate of return is you invest a dollar today, which you could spend today, and it gets a certain amount of marginal utility, or you can invest it, and in the future you're going to get a certain amount of marginal utility. And that trade-off you're supposed to learn about through the rate of inflation. That's why we take the nominal interest rate and deflate it with the expectation of inflation over the future period. Now, and that gives us the return to investment, which is one of the most central things about economic growth. So I'm going to start out by asking the question of whether it's possible that inflation and growth mismeasurement has accelerated. And I'm going to basically be kind of asserting that. You'll see whether you agree with me. I'm beginning with a very simplified discussion of how we measure output growth and inflation, which we really don't need, but because of what Anna has said. But the point is one of the points I want to make, and that Anna made in her presentation, was that when you have growth through quality rather than through quantity, it's harder to measure. You may need to go to something like Genomics for this. And I'm going to present some very recent work that suggests that inflation mismeasurement may have accelerated, quite likely at least 1%. Now making statements like that is highly controversial, and no small group of studies is going to convince anybody about that. But I'm pointing out really recent work that suggests this. And I'm going to argue strenuously that rapid advances in technology and consumption are occurring, and that, there's been a lot of acceleration from 1995 to the present, but also I'm going to argue that an awful lot of this took place after 2005, 2007. I'm going to argue, my basic claim is that productivity growth is actually very strong. My personal opinion is that productivity growth has accelerated, not slowed. And that if that's true, prices are likely deflating around the world. So basically what we do, as Anna explained, is we take total consumer expenditures by summing transactions. And that's ultimately what the economy is supposed to do, make consumers better off. And we deflate by taking the price change of very precisely defined goods chosen at particular retail outlets from one month to the next, and we rate that by transactions. And doing so, as Anna showed, holds quality constant. This works well as long as there's no new products or quality change. Shapiro and Wilcox pointed that out. There are no products with zero prices. That's the work that I did with Rachel and John. And there's no change in information on the part of consumers that affect the value of existing products. By 2015, in the Grosjean et al. Paper that recently came out, they disappeared 5% per month permanently. So they're disappearing every 20 months. So there's more rapid product turnover. And our standard procedures don't measure quality improvements when new products appear, except under some circumstances. But this is the main way the economy improves. So we need custom ways like Genomics to measure this. But these problems are everywhere, right? It's very hard to do a single regression in one area of the economy, right? To do this everywhere is very, very difficult. But we've had amazing progress. Most of these in the last dozen years. Space rockets, DNA sequencing, electric batteries, self-driving cars, two-way mass communication, artificial intelligence, age-related macular degeneration, streaming entertainment. And then our procedures don't measure free goods, and there is no transactions to deflate. And here, the internet, particularly the mobile internet, has a big role, because what it has done is it means that reproducing an intangible now costs nothing, or nearly nothing. So intangibles are non-rival, and their marginal cost of reproduction is zero. So, whether, so the optimal price is zero. Right? And there are ways that we do that with, by bundling things. So when we have a streaming subscription, the marginal cost of a given item is zero. Right? And that's why bundling is such a great model with the internet now. Everything, the marginal cost is zero. Similarly with free products that are supported by advertising. The optimal price is zero, and that's what Google and Facebook deliver. "20 years ago, we thought inflation was overstated by 1% or thereabouts. I'm going to argue that it's quite possible that inflation has accelerated by 1%, although, there are huge error bands around that statement. And that would mean that the U.S. was deflating through the Great Recession, and probably still is. And that would help explain very low long-term nominal rates around the world. Big changes in timings, right? And this is not just in the U.S., this is everywhere around the world. According to 2018, according to Nielsen, adults spent 4 hours a day on the internet. About 3 hours of that was on cell phones and tablets, which didn't exist until 2007. And in 2007, they estimate roughly an hour per adult. So there's been a 4 times increase. And 4 hours a day is a lot of time, right? If you average all the time that American adults spend working, counting in holidays and weekends and retirement, it's less than 4 hours a day. What was that time worth? Why do we do this? Well, we have free products and other new capabilities of smartphones. But how do we measure this value? Well, one way to measure this value is by just asking people, how much would I have to pay you not to use, Facebook, or not to use a search engine, or not to use GPS. So, you know, I was just in Oslo, now I'm in London. I'm paying $10 a day to use my smartphone, because I'm not very savvy about these things. But that's what my US company charges me. I'm happy to pay that, and the only reason that I need to have that access is because of GPS. One function is what I'm paying for, right? It's my ability to get across London in a reasonable period of time. And that's $3,600 a year, $10 a day. Anyway, Brynjolfsson asked them, and when you add up all the different functions, the median user said it adds up to $30,000. So that's half of actual total consumer US expenditures per person, about $60,000. They have another measure, which is 5,000. If you just ask them, people, you know, to give up the internet, what would we have to pay you? You get a number that looks like $5,000. But you know, when you ask that question, are people really focusing on all the different ways that they use the internet? And anyway, so I would say the true answer is probably somewhere in between those two. But these are really big numbers, right? You're talking about something like 10% of consumer expenditures. So Byrne and Corrado have a paper that just looks at internet and smartphone usage, looking at all the expenditures associated with that, including the smartphones and the internet access costs. And they get that PCE growth just from that few percent of personal consumption expenditures has been understated by 0.65% a year over the period 2007 to 2017. Mo Abderrahman and co-authors at ONS have a paper in which, if we count bytes as a relevant quantity of output over the internet or cell phone services, right? And I could argue that bytes is a very relevant measure of that. You get 60% at average growth per year, right? So right now, internet and cellular access costs about 1.5%. So you multiply 60% by 1.5%, you get a 0.9% impact on PCE growth from that 1.5% of the economy. And all of these are accelerations of mismeasurement from the early 1990s, and most of this is an acceleration since 2007, when we really launched into the internet, the mobile internet. How about variety? Well, Aghion et al. In a recent AER paper measured the consumption value of new outlets. Remember, we measure constant quality by looking at prices at a given outlet. So, so when we switch from Barnes & Noble to Amazon sells stuff for 10% less. With this constant quality measure, we think Amazon must be selling us inferior products because they're 10% less in price. And so Amazon shrinks GDP. So they're trying to capture this by looking at the rate of turnover of new outlets. And they argued that inflation back in 83-95 was 0.52%, undermeasured due to new outlets, and now it's 0.65% to 2006 to 2014. And by the way, this 0.65% is bigger than the number for the intervening period, 1995 to 2005. Neiman and Vavra, with the recent working paper, it hasn't yet been published, argued that product variety at grocery stores and drugstores. So this is looking at the variety of things like tortilla chips or Greek yogurt, things like that. And they, looking at the data from 2004 to 2016 with the calibrated models, say that product variety would add 0.8% annually to output growth in grocery and drugstores. And if there's a 0.52% in 83 to 95 to 0.65% in the Agion study is an acceleration of about 25%, which more or less goes in line with what the BLS rate of product disappearance. So if I conjecture that Neiman and Vavra don't have estimates back to 1983-95, but if there is a 25% acceleration, then maybe the missing growth due to product variety was 0.64 in 83-95. Right? So if you add those two mismeasurements together, we go from 1.2 to 1.5 roughly. If you add in 0.6 or 0.9 for internet cell phone service, you're pretty close to 1% there. And that's just looking at parts of the economy. So let's just look at what's happened since 2005. Right? Apple introduces the iPhone in 2007. iPhone apps aren't introduced until 2008. iPad 2010, Siri 2011. Now there are 2 billion iPhones and Androids worldwide, used 2 to 4 hours daily. So Google doesn't start Google Maps till 2005. YouTube begins in 2005. Google buys it in 2006. Android comes to market in 2008. Waymo starts in 2009. The AI firm DeepMind in 2010. Amazon Prime gets started in 2005. It now has 100 million subscribers in the United States. There are only 120 million households in the United States. It's an amazing rate of saturation. Amazon Web Services start, the cloud doesn't begin until 2006, Kindle in 2007, Alexa in 2012. Facebook doesn't open to all comers until 2006. Until then, you had to be at a highfalutin college to get in. WhatsApp starts in 2009, Snapchat in 2011. There are now 1.5 billion daily active users on Facebook and 1 billion on WhatsApp. So these have huge impacts on consumers, on all of our behavior. How can we have such fast change and slow measured growth? Well, the consumer products of Google, Facebook, Amazon, and Apple, I would argue, do not add to productivity growth. Right? So Google and Facebook are free products. You don't know how to include zero prices in our inflation measures. And free products replace tangible merchandise like CDs and film. Unmeasured quality change. I already made the point that Amazon low costs translate into lower output, not lower inflation. Outsourcing. Apple in our statistics does sell consumer products, but it looks like an importing wholesaler, right? It imports its iPhones from China, and what's really happening is that Apple is exporting its intellectual property to China. It's then being embedded in the iPhone and being brought back into the United States, but that export is not visible in the statistics, and so it looks like a pure import, and so it should not show up in U.S. GDP. Genome sequencing costs, right? The white line there is Moore's law. The green line is the rate of decline in the cost of the genome. This data is from the NIH. And it was, in 2007, it cost $1 million to decode a genome. That's when somebody, and that was the second genome to be decoded fully. By 2015, the second generation of genome sequencing ushered in by Illumina Corporation brought the price down to $1,000. Illumina has announced that by 2020 the price will be $100. So from being an insuperable cost, it's going to be quite cheap to do lots and lots of genome sequencing. So it's become standard in scientific practice to sequence biological specimens. And there's been price drops everywhere, and almost all the things that you see here have occurred since 2007. So there's the DNA sequencing, a 10,000-fold improvement. DNA manipulation, there's this new process called CRISPR-Cas9, which enables you to precisely cut, remove a gene, and replace a gene. The previous process cost $5,000. They brought that price down to $75 in 2015, and in 2019 they're quoting $30. And just think about what that means in terms of genomic manipulation and things like genomic medicine, cloud computing, right? The Byrne et al. Study shows that cloud computing prices fell 2 to 3 times in a relatively short number of years. But the big change was for internet startups. That internet startups used to have to buy servers and routers and hire IT people to run all that stuff before they could get their internet startup going. Now all they do is they hook up to Amazon. Amazon actually gives them 3 months of free time, and the price of a startup relative to doing it yourself for cloud computing is 1,000 or 100 times cheaper. Rocketry, the SpaceX developed Falcon 9 rocket, which is now the workhorse for putting satellites up at 1/10 the cost of what the development costs that NASA calculated it ought to cost, and it brought down the cost per flight 3 times. This has had a dramatic effect on the feasibility of the commercial exploitation of space. Now, there are literally dozens of companies that are pursuing space, commercial space opportunities. AI, I have a long song and dance about this, but basically the transition from the ability to play poker is just dramatic. What a couple of new algorithms did to the cost of calculating how to play poker well brought the price down from $1 million to $1 million to something like $150. The self-driving car lidar, this is using lasers instead of radio for as a radar system. The price was $75,000. It's now $1,000 to $500. LED bulbs have fallen in price by 10 times and are now the dominant bulb around the world. Lithium batteries have fallen in price by 16 times. To give you an idea of what that means, a 75 kilowatt hour is what the amount of batteries that a Tesla car requires. That did cost over $75,000 before this set in. It's now down to $7,500. So it's now become, electric cars have become feasible. There's a great story about age-related macular degeneration. 2 million people suffer from this. Previous treatments meant that your chance of deterioration of your vision to the point where you can't drive was 90%. A new drug came in that cost $2,000 a shot. You needed to do it 12 times a year. Turned out that there was another drug that you could buy at 1/40th of the cost. Right? So it brought it down to $50 a shot. So instead of $24,000, it's $600. Now multiply that by 2 million customers, and you're talking about a lot of money for Medicaid or the NHS. So, how we see the world looks a lot different if we change the inflation rate by 2%. Right? Long-term real rates have fallen by 3 percentage points to near zero. Right? If we were mismeasuring by 1% in the 90s, right, then we had a 4% average. Now, on this argument, it would have fallen to 2%, right, which is, I don't know, within the bounds of reason. if we have 0 real rates, nobody knows the price, the value of any asset in the world. We don't know how to deflate rates of return. I've just talked about how rapidly things have changed from 2005 to 2017. But according to our statistics, real growth per capita has plummeted. And it's half the rate of it's been in any 12-year period. And it's 1.4% less than the rest of the post-war period. Could that be true, given the rate of change that we're seeing? I would argue that it's much more likely that we're going faster than 2.2% per capita. And that would mean that we have 1.5% acceleration in price mismeasurement. If the view that the US economy and the world economy has slowed down during this period of rapid change, then the corporations that are earning big profits are doing it for nothing. I don't think that's credible. I think the corporations I talked about are clearly offering a lot of consumer value. Anyway, these problems require new approaches. A bunch of us have suggested a second measure of GDP that's focused on welfare, and that as we explore that, we then move pieces from the second measure of GDP into GDP proper as we get agreement on these quality changes. And there's a ton of work going on that people are doing about this. I think I'm running out of time here, but I do want to say the reason I think this stuff is super important is that I think that the super fast change we're undergoing is a big part of the problem that the world is experiencing right now. What economists say is that the reason people are unhappy is there's no real growth, there's no productivity growth. Right? But we're expanding our capabilities at lightning speed. There are social and ethical problems that are associated with the speed of all this stuff. The biggest one, I would argue, is the high cost and rapid depreciation of human capital. But two-way mass communication, this is the first time we've ever had two-way mass communication. And as we go through this, things get very complicated, right? There's all this stuff about privacy and about the undermining of democracy and so forth, free speech and on. Genome manipulation. We have no clue as to how to set standards for genome manipulation. Robots, self-driving cars, and drones, right? What are the rules, ethical rules that we are going to place on these things, right? If you have a self-driving car, it might kill somebody. Well, there's an old, favorite ethical dilemma, which is if you have a car and it might kill one person or it might kill 20, how do you decide that? Right? Well, philosophers haven't figured that out, but that's another problem that we're at. Space commercial exploitation, we've got no rules of the road for space commercial exploitation. And nations are racing to the moon and beyond, but we don't know how to talk about that. Brain-machine interface. I could have shown 40 studies that shed light on this stuff, all of which has been done in the last few years. A bunch of the studies have been done at BEA, but coordinating this research and maintaining it statistically over time so that we can make a time series, it's a huge task that, is, I would argue, would require at least doubling statistical agencies' budgets in the United States and around the world. Statistical agencies need much, much more money and much, much more help from top teams. I really appreciate your time. The main thing I'm trying to do here is provoke a conversation. I don't know much, but I'm trying to get us to think about the world around us. I have had some additional slides in case I had more time. We'll leave it here.
Thank you.